Just pause that for now. Right, people have started joining us. Welcome. If you just come in, we're due to start in a couple of minutes, so please do just make yourself comfortable. And if you're happy to find the chat, someone's already done it. You've obviously been to one of our webinars before. Please do find the chat, type in there your name, where you're joining us from, and remember in the little drop-down menu to pick everyone rather than hosts and panelists. Otherwise, only we can see where you've joined us from. So the fastest on the keyboard today are from St Thomas's in Salisbury and from Lichfield. To 2 Fionas, look at that. 2 Fionas in a row. Welcome, both of you. From Lincoln and Plymouth. Oh, that's good. Somebody joining from Spab. That's good to see. Welcome. Welcome all. How are we doing? We've got just another minute until we'll get started. Right. People are joining in good numbers from Birmingham and Suffolk and Wimborne Minster. Oh, and they're going too fast for me to read them. Another person from Spab, from Whitstable. Welcome all. Oh, somebody from North Wales and Cornwall and Bath. And Nottingham, got all around the country. I wonder who'll be our most northerly person today. We've often got somebody from, there we go. Newcastle. I wonder if you'll be the most northerly or whether somebody will join. Oh, somebody joining from America. Tobit, you have an international following.
Last time I saw John, it was an awful lot closer than America.
Are you seeing names that you recognise?
Mm-hmm.
Right, that is 4 o'clock. I will get us started. Because I'm sure more people will join, but they can join during the housekeeping. So let me get the recording started and then we will get going. Right, I think. Just trying to work out whether the recording. Welcome everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's Net Zero Carbon webinar, which is on a really, really interesting and really important topic for all of us who are responsible for beautiful listed buildings all around the country. So today we're looking at conservation pitfalls, what can go wrong and how to avoid those things as we're all working away towards trying to get to net zero carbon. I always begin my webinars with the trailer of upcoming attractions. So we're up here today on the first run of today's topic. If you get to the end and you think, I really wish that my colleague had been there, don't worry. Firstly, we're recording it. And secondly, we're running it again on the 7th of December. So please do, you can be our sales force when we finished here today and go and tell colleagues and friends about it and make sure they come along to the next run on the 7th of December. And then we've got 2 other webinars coming up, both of which I think are going to be so useful. So the one on Monday is on how to get a yes for your environmental project. So working through the faculty system, we've got DAC, we've got an architect coming who's also a member of the Church Buildings Council. We've got a DAC secretary, an archdeacon and a church buildings officer. So you'll really get that insight into the faculty system and how it works. And then we've got the first of the runs of our new topic on assessing embodied carbon. So that's all of that carbon that goes into actually doing a project. How do we try and get a feeling for how much that is? More importantly, while we get, the housekeeping, before I get onto the more importantly, the housekeeping. I use the Q&A for the questions rather than the chat. So if you move your mouse around, find a Q&A, that's where to pop your questions. You can see other people's questions and you can click the thumbs up next to the ones that are of interest to you. Those ones will rise to the top, and the time that Tobit and I have at the end will focus on the questions that get the most votes. After the webinar, I'll send you around the slides and a link through to the feedback form. It might not be till early next week, I have to say, because I've got tomorrow off. And the recording will be loaded up onto our website on the same page where we list all of the upcoming dates. That's where we put all the recordings, so it'll be available there on our website. Most importantly, you're here to hear from Tobit. you're in very safe hands today, I can assure you. So Tobit is an architectural conservator running his own practice, specialising in the diagnosis and control of environmental deterioration in historic buildings, exactly what we're trying to avoid by hearing from him today about what could go wrong and how to avoid it. Lots of work, churches, cathedrals, and through other heritage buildings with English Heritage, the National Trust and the Historic Royal Palaces. He's a member of the Institute of Conservation, a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, and a fellow of the International Institute of Conservation. So basically, Tobit knows his stuff. So let me stop talking and stop sharing my slides and hand over to you, Tobit, to take us away.
Thanks, Catherine. Let's see if we can share this. Let's go to, there we go. Does that look?
Work first time, perfect.
Work first time, let me just see. Okay, still working? Good. Thank you for that, and good afternoon, everybody. As Catherine said, I'm actually trained as a conservator. I'm trained as a wall painting conservator many years ago, and we still do work on wall paintings, but we work increasingly on environmental issues in churches and how to do conservation developments in churches while protecting the historic fabric from environmental deterioration, which is actually what we're trying to do the whole time when we are trying to be environmentally sensitive in its other sense, sustainable. So what I've done is pull together a series of slides about the types of projects that we are looking at, where the risks are and how to avoid them. As Catherine said, there'll be time for questions at the end, but if there's anything burning during the course of the talk, do just stick up your hand or ask. I have split it into 3 bits to try and make it as approachable as possible, just to try and clarify what sort of projects on the route to net zero we're talking about, because it's this whole field is a big and amorphous field, and it's very often misunderstood or confused. What are we trying to change? What are the parameters in these buildings that we are trying to change? And then how do we do it? And where are the risks and pitfalls? How do we avoid running into problems? Start off with this. We still need to use our churches in their traditional manner. A lot of the churches are still being used exactly as they have been for the last 20 years, but at the same time, a lot are changing their pattern of use. There is a much greater need to use churches and cathedrals for a wide range of activity and community engagement. And the important thing is, this is something that we haven't done in our churches before. We want them to perform differently, and we want them to perform with a lower carbon footprint. So it's quite a challenge. We are looking to change the usability of the building to make it more usable, whatever that means. It means a whole lot of things, and that's one of the reasons some of these projects don't go terribly smoothly. The lack of definition of what we're actually trying to change. We're trying to make our buildings more sustainable, we're trying to make them more comfortable, and we are trying to make them more sustainable in conservation terms with a reduced carbon footprint. In practical terms, that I think generally means 3 things. We want to change the environmental performance of the building. That means make the building more thermally efficient, make the building more comfortable to use, make the building less susceptible to the sort of deterioration that we have to deal with the whole time, because every project you undertake costs a certain amount of carbon, and so you want to try and, when you do an intervention, make sure it works for the long term. We want to change our personal conditions. Now, this when I was talking to Catherine about this earlier on, we wondered about the terminology here. A lot of the time people feel cold in a building and they say the building's cold. And the question is it really cold, or is it the way that you are using the building which is making you feel cold? And I think this is worth addressing, and you'll see why in a little bit. And then we want to get on to the artificial influences, the mechanical services, ventilation, heating, the sort of thing that people really start to focus on when they talk about carbon footprint. But That's only part of the process. And unless you get the first 2 bits right, it's very hard to get that 3rd bit right. Yet that's the one that everyone focuses on. So that's why I put at the bottom always in this order: building, personal, and then mechanical and artificial influences. Why do we care about this? Why are we worried about this? Why don't we just make our buildings more efficient? It tends to be the unintended consequences which cause problems. I mean, often I will see very well designed interventions work pretty effectively. They will reduce the amount of energy that's being used. They will improve the usability of the church. They will then cause condensation underneath the lead, which then starts to deteriorate at an alarming rate and needs to be replaced in 20 years. It's those unintended consequences which often, in fact, there's a long history of this in conservation, building conservation generally. So either you end up with, in projects that don't work, either you end up with poor or inefficient results. It doesn't actually make the building feel better to use. It doesn't actually save you energy. Or you do something which then causes direct damage to the fabric, the collection, the furnishings, whatever it is. Or you're one of the projects that gets it right. But we're looking this today at projects that go wrong and things that go wrong. I think, I mean, again, when we were talking about what to discuss in this, most of these sorts of talks show really good projects. They show the ones that you're proud of. They show the ones that went right, which is great. But it's actually very instructive to look at the ones that didn't go as well, or where you've seen things that haven't performed quite as expected, and look at why and learn from them for next time. So when we have a project and we want to make our church more sustainable on our path to net zero and more usable, what are we actually trying to change? What are the steps in the project that we will try and change? Now, the biggest, most overriding one is the building envelope. If you are in a church which is in poor condition, almost inevitably, any attempt to make the internal conditions better, to make it more energy efficient, more sustainable, will fail or won't work very well. And so even in the simplest of sort of net zero steps and sustainability steps, the first thing you need to do is get on top of the building envelope and the rainwater disposal system. Buildings like this work as a system. The envelope is there to keep water on the outside. The rainwater disposal system is there to get that water and take it away from the building. That's how all buildings function. If yours doesn't function like that because of its condition, you will constantly be struggling with what you're doing on the inside. Next thing we tend to be trying to change is the performance of that envelope. A lot of our buildings were constructed with a particular set of requirements, one of which wasn't keeping us particularly warm. And so they function very well for what they were built, but we're asking for different things. We'll come to this in more detail later on, but it's very easy to look at a church like this with nice thick walls and reasonably, this one's got quite big windows, but you often have very small windows, very, very well insulated until you get to the roof, which is the weakest part in the whole system, and that undermines everything else. So we often want to change the way that that building envelope works. It's not only the external envelope that we're concerned about. In many cases, we generate heat in one location or another in a building, and it disappears into another bit of the building that we don't want it to. In this case, through lath and plaster vaults into a roof space. So it's not necessarily that external part of the skin, it's the internal parts too. The more you can recognize this, the more you can read a building and see where these weaknesses are, the more likely you are to be able to target it and control them with your various interventions. Some buildings are inherently weak. we saw what the roofs of buildings look like. I mean, this actually, the one on the left isn't a church, but it's exactly the same as some churches I've seen where heaters have been put on the inside of lath and plaster walls, and guess what? Most of the heat is coming out. But even with cathedrals, this is at Peterborough Cathedral, where you can see the heater on the inside of the wall, which is 1.5 meters thick. And even there, the energy is escaping to the outside. And air leakage. Again, buildings weren't constructed to be particularly airtight. And so what is sometimes quite useful when you have high levels of ventilation undermines things like thermal performance and heating. And so we need to recognize where that's going on as well. When you're looking at an historic building such as a church, it's important to understand what it does in terms of the building environment. Modern buildings, or 20th century buildings, were constructed with the idea of sealing the external weather on the outside, and then putting big machines on the inside to create a set of conditions that you wanted to live in. This is not how traditional structures, and certainly not how our church structures work. They moderate conditions. So highly unstable conditions on the outside are moderated by the building to produce conditions on the inside which are comfortable for us to use. We're not going to be looking at lots of charts today, but the chart you're looking at is of a little church in West Sussex, nice, very well built church. On the outside, you can see with those grey lines the very, very unstable humidities and temperatures. And on the inside, you can see with the red and the blue lines, the blue is temperature and the red is humidity. And you can see that buildings provide this buffering, this softening of that effect. That's what they're trying to do. And again, when we're trying to improve their performance, we're trying to make those internal lines flatter and flatter in order to prevent the external weather, which is driving our environment, from affecting the conditions on the inside. So again, coming back to the sort of project design, trying to work out what it is you're trying to do when you insulate a roof. Actually, you're trying to stop the influence of the outside getting in and the whatever you've generated inside getting out. Furnishings. We have and we constantly are changing the furnishings in our churches. I always think this is quite an instructive picture. Box pews, with which many churches were furnished until the 19th century, weren't there simply for design reasons or because they looked nice. They were very functional. They formed little compartments. Inside those little compartments, you could make yourself warm and cozy. If you look at the John Everett Millais first and second sermon, this is a perfect example. That's not where he painted it. This is a perfect example of how you kept yourself cozy and warm in a church up until the 20th century. Now, of course, we've stripped those out. In the 19th century, they stripped them out, but we are constantly doing it even more these days. We're taking away a lot of the pieces of the church which made it comfortable, and we're making it an inherently harder building to be warm in. And we don't tend to recognize that. We take out our pews to make our space more multifunctional, and suddenly we've taken away, if it's box pews, we've taken away the place that you can make yourself cozy in. Normal pews, you've taken away all the things you can attach some radiators to immediately close to you. So those changes in the way that we use a building have a direct influence on how we can make it a comfortable building to use. And we tend to be not very joined up in our thinking about this. And our furnishings, we don't like soft furnishings anymore. We're taking them all away. And this is rather unpleasant picture is of what happens if you sit on a cold, uninsulated pew. You lose lots of energy to it. So again, we take things away for reasons of presentation. And actually, we again make our buildings colder, feel colder. We're also very good at not dressing appropriately for some of our churches. Now, I know this is a really difficult one, and those sort of architects and people that are working with church communities to say how, or to help them use their church, make them more usable, often say, oh, we can't tell people to dress differently. And I think, well, you can't tell people to dress differently, but I think it's an important discussion to have. Now, this slide shows my feet in a cold church. And actually it's not a church, it's a cold historic building of another sort. And it just sort of demonstrates what the issue is. I had my breakfast in the morning, I metabolized that breakfast, I generated heat, I went in rather thin shoes and I stood on that floor and I left some of that heat behind me. I'm now colder and I want the church warden to turn the heating up. Going back to the first and second sermon picture, people used these buildings very differently in the past. Now, this sort of comes down to how you are going to use your church in the future. If it's going to be a space which is constantly being used for community activities and worship and concerts and all those sorts of things, you can sometimes justifiably warm it, heat it in a way that you won't suffer from the problem I'm showing you. If it's a church that it's not going to be possible to do that, maybe it's one that can only be used in the summer. Maybe it's one that can only be used at certain times of year when it's warm enough. So this sort of heat loss isn't necessarily a problem. And we're very much at a tipping point with what to do with many of our historic churches. And we spent a lot of time discussing how to make them sustainable. But usability is a wide and complicated area. There are those ones which have the communities and have the people coming in and have that range of uses, which you can then be very clever about developing. And those are really the ones we'll concentrate on later on this afternoon. But there are plenty when one might say, in order to make them sustainable, you can't do all of these clever heating things. You can just use them at certain times of year. You still need them repaired. You still need to clean the gutters, etc., etc. But it's a different sort of usability and sustainability. And I think it's something one has to have more of a conversation now, and increasingly so as church populations decrease, yet we still want these buildings to survive and be well conserved. Small boy of my acquaintance agreed to sit in a cold building and just show what happened with coats on and hats on, just to reinforce the point about heat loss and clothing. And then heating and mechanical services. I have over here. Now, we'll talk more about heating because it's one of the big things in this whole debate. But just to show you that different types of heat have a very different impact on buildings and on warming of people. Broadly, it's worth thinking about in terms of convective heating and radiant heating. I'm sure many of you will recognize this already, but for most of our history, most of the history of human beings, we have had radiant heating. We have gone into rooms where there were hot fires, and one side of our face would get hot and the other would be cold, because radiant heat produces heat through infrared radiation. It crosses and touches, affects the surface with little effect on the air. Eventually it warms up the room and everything else gets warm and the air gets warm as well. Then from the mid-20th century onwards, we started to develop warm air heating in our houses, central heating, and we got very used to the fact that you would walk into a room and both sides of your face would be warm at the same time, and you could walk around into different places, it would all be the same, which is fine if you're in a small space. But the moment you translate that to a larger space, here at Peterborough Cathedral, you find that this warm convective air shoots straight up above your head, in this case onto the 12th century vault, and it is an inherently inefficient way of heating these tall spaces. It is easy to implement because you just put generators around the place, heat generators. But it actually doesn't work very well. I think, yes, a couple of other slides have shown where heat goes. That one on the right-hand side. People are in the bottom bit. They're in the 2 meters at the bottom, which is blue. All of the heat is sitting up at the top. So how and where we generate heat, how we make sure it is actually warming the right thing is terribly important. So those are the things that we are trying to change in broad terms when we are doing a project which is helping us towards net zero. I mean, on the whole, people aren't suddenly going to the church and saying, we want to have a more sustainable church, but we don't actually want to make it any better to use. People are saying we want to make our churches better to use and sustainable in that sense. And while we're doing it, we also want to reduce our carbon footprint. That tends to be the shape of the projects. So here we are. We are now using our buildings in ways for which they were not designed, ways they've never been used before. So is it any surprise that they struggle to be successful? It means we have to be very clever and imaginative about how we implement these changes, both to work and also not to damage the building. The key thing, and it's a very dull point to make, I'm afraid, which is why it's a very dull slide, but planning is very, very important here, and possibly that first point is the key one, actually agreeing the aims. Many projects I get involved with, people have a general aspiration about what they want to do, but often people end up saying they want it to be a multifunctional space, which is often just a way of not making the decision about which of those 12 functions you actually want the space for. It's very difficult to make a medieval church work for everything. You need to actually define more precisely what you're doing. Now, allow flexibility, of course, but try and define it. Agree with the PCC what you're going to do. You obviously need everyone on board for this. Consider the long-term usability of the church as well as the immediate future. Changing church populations, we've talked about. Changing needs and uses. All of those things for the next 25 years rather than for the next 2 years. And early on in the process, start that discussion with your professional advisors. This can be very informal in the first instance. Say we are trying to do this. We want to have concerts. We want to have messy church. We want to have services. These are the sort of 6 or 7 key things we want to do. And by the way, we want to have this sort of heating. And they might say, that's great, but actually that's not really going to serve that particular purpose. If you have that conversation early on, you can be guided in the right direction. You won't spend an awful lot of time and energy developing part of a project, which you then have to row back on when you find it's not actually going to deliver what you think. It's important as part of that same discussion to understand why the building isn't working very well now. I mean, some buildings you walk into and they're ready to change straight away because they're in excellent condition, but many you walk into and you find that they aren't performing well because there's air leakage, because they're in poor condition, because there's water in the structure. So you know what the things to do are just to make the building work properly before you start to change it. Understand how the interventions are actually going to work. Heating, for instance, is one that often goes wrong because people misunderstand how different heating systems, how different heating sources actually work. And they then find that they don't meet the aspirations outlined in that first point. So understand the technical side. Now, again, your professional advisors should be advising on this, but ask them the questions. And linked onto this is only discuss the means of delivering these projects when you've worked out what the project actually is, once you've worked out the aims. Now, the classic one is, I will go into a building and I will be told that people want to use a heat pump. I like heat pumps, just like everyone else likes heat pumps. And then they say they actually only want to use it once a month and they want quick heating to come on and off so they can just heat a few pews at a time. And then you have to explain that heat pumps don't work like that. So don't leap to the technical conclusions before you've really worked out what the aims are, and then say, how do we best achieve this? And maybe heat pump is it, but you see what I mean. And also a degree of bluntness and honesty about what one is trying to do with sustainability. Are you trying to reduce your carbon footprint? Are you trying to reduce your heating bills? They're not the same thing. There's a whole sort of series of things like this. We all want to be more sustainable and closer to net zero, but what are we actually asking of that particular project? Those are my sort of starting points for most projects. In terms of the changes you're going to be implementing, back to the boring old building envelope, it absolutely must be in good condition. Otherwise, everything else will fail further down the line. And by good condition, I don't only mean repaired. There needs to be a program of maintenance. There is no simpler form of sustainability than making sure that the building envelope can be sustained in good condition. Now, this is really difficult, as we all know, because it is not easy, but it is comparatively easy to get capital for a major repair project. It is far harder to get ongoing maintenance funding for clearing the drains, and yet that's all gutters, and yet that's often what causes the problem a long way down the line. But the stability and condition of the building envelope is utterly key, and same with the rainwater disposal system. Most of the projects which have major problems with moisture and the like do because of these two elements. Drainage, water transfer, it's less straightforward than you might think, but again, a good church architect and engineer will be able to help you design that, but it needs to be top of the list. And unfortunately, drainage is probably the most boring element of the project. It's not the one that you're going to put on the front of your fundraising brochure, but it's probably the one that, if you get it wrong, will undermine everything else. So learn to love drainage, move that to the top of the priority list. Everything else after that will work much better. Then once we've got our building working as it should, the question is, do we want to change it? Is it good enough? For many churches, it is. It's always going to be a little cold and a little drafty, but if there isn't water coming in, and that's fine. That's as good as you're going to get. From a conservation point of view, it's fine. From a usability point of view, maybe you're not going to be having children's groups and concerts 3 times a week. Maybe actually it's going to be something far more simple, and that's sufficient. Or maybe you want to change the building. Maybe you want to make it better, warmer, more usable. Air leakage, referred to before, is a significant one. Maybe you want to, and I'm not suggesting this for any churches, but interventions which make a difference. On the right-hand side, we've got a church, in fact, the church with that data I showed you earlier, Hardham in West Sussex, where they reinstalled the ceiling. The 18th century lath and plaster ceiling had been taken out, revealing the timbers, which perfectly nice timbers were, particularly historic. But as a result, there was an enormous amount of air leakage through that roof, which made the internal environment very unstable, made producing stable heat very difficult. The ceiling was reinstalled, traditional lath and plaster. In fact, they did insulate it behind it, and it improved the thermal performance of the church immensely, and the stability. In this particular case, it also has hugely important very early wall paintings, which is what drove the project. But reinstalling ceilings, which wouldn't have been even considered 25 years ago, is now something which we are looking at again. The use of secondary doors, of glazed lobbies and porches makes a considerable difference. It's not something you will do in all cases because it's a major intervention. But if air leakage via the main doors is the key thing, then that's a tool that you can use to change the performance of the building. Insulation, thermal insulation, I should say. Everyone seems to love thermal insulation. It is just a way of changing the thermal performance of the outer element or one of the inner elements of the building envelope. It can be very beneficial, but is it necessary? I had a case recently when I was asked to advise on insulation in a roof of a church, which would have been quite complicated. And the conversation moved on to how often you use the church and how often it's heated. And it was used very irregularly, and it had the heating turned on for an hour before and off after the service. And the question was, what's the insulation going to do? The whole point of the insulation would be, if you warm the building up, to make sure the heat doesn't get out, so you don't have to put more heat in to keep people warm in the building for a long time. But if you're only actually using it an hour every couple of weeks, then there's no one to keep the heat in there afterwards for. So why do you need the building to be more thermally efficient? Insulation has a carbon footprint. You've got to make it, you've got to ship it in, you've got to put up scaffolding, you've got to drive it there in diesel trucks. So you end up with a carbon deficit once you put it in, and you hopefully will pay it back fairly swiftly if you're putting it in the right place and using it efficiently. But it isn't a neutral intervention. And so it's very important to actually work out what you will gain from putting this stuff in. If you are going down the route of insulation, to look very carefully at the type of material you're using. There is often a trade-off between very sustainable, some of the sort of wood fiber and hemp materials, and some of the more the synthetic materials which have much more performance within a much smaller section. Which actually works for you? I know we would all prefer to use the more sustainably sourced materials, but actually sometimes they won't work given how the building is built. So one has to be terribly, again, honest about what we are trying to achieve. If the important thing is reducing heat loss, and the only way to do it is using a less sustainable material, there you are. That's your cost-benefit analysis to sit down and work out. If you can use, if you have the space to use a sustainably sourced material, even better. But you can see where that discussion needs to go, and it doesn't happen as often as it should. We talked about unintended consequences early on, and I think this is an important one which comes up with insulation quite a lot. Here we've got a roof in a chapel, lath and plaster roof, which was very poorly insulated, lots of heat going up into the roof space. And so experiments were done to see what happened when you insulated with mineral wool, see about the heat escaping or being kept in the chapel, because it was being used quite regularly. It was a good example of where you might want to use insulation responsibly. All well and good, but up until the insulation going in, the roof space was reasonably warm. And so when condensation happened on the slates, it evaporated fairly quickly. And it didn't happen that often because the roof was fairly warm. Now the roof is all insulated. And so the heat isn't getting into the roof space and isn't warming it. And so the roof space is colder. And so the slates are colder. So the condensation on the slates is more regular and it isn't evaporating as fast. Are we worried about that? I don't know, it's being monitored to have a look at it at the moment, but we should be questioning it. We should be saying, we are making this change for beneficial reasons. What are the unintended consequences? And are we happy with them? Now, in this particular case, I think it is not a particular risk, but you can see the point here that we tend to focus on the good things and we ignore the potential bad things. Many of you will be familiar with underside lead corrosion, which is probably the most catastrophic example of this in recent years. If there's another one, please do tell me, but this is a good example. Code 8 lead on a church roof should last for 100, 120 years, something like that. In the 70s and 80s, we started putting in much more warm air heating into churches. Roof structures and roof designs were changed, and you ended up with a situation where you were getting insulation underneath lead. In this case, it's just fiberboard insulation. condensation was happening in these warm roofs that was sitting there underneath the lead, and it started, rather than forming the lead carbonate, that grey, that dark grey, which protects the lead, it formed something called hydroceracite, which is this white powdery deterioration, which is self-sustaining. So once it starts to form, it just keeps on forming. It then acts as a sort of poultice, as a blotting paper underneath the lead, and lead, which should last a century, was failing in 25 years, purely because of the design of heating and insulation that we had chosen to put in. And many churches and cathedrals are still living with that. Now that's now recognized, so new roofs and refurbished, repaired roofs are being designed differently. But it's a very good reminder of how our clever interventions can go terribly badly wrong. And hopefully it'll make us think much more carefully about those unintended consequences. I'm regularly asked about secondary glazing in historic buildings, in windows, to see whether it is worth doing protective glazing on stained glass windows in order to improve the performance of the building. There isn't time to go into how it all works, but the short answer is that ventilated protective glazing does increase the U value of that particular section of glass reasonably. But actually, when you look at the surface area of glazing and the surface area of the interior of the church, and the cost of doing good conservation grade environmental protective glazing, you'll find that the benefits are very, very small indeed. So it's not generally recommended for that. Ventilation, air exchange. This is a particular bugbear of mine, as some of you might know. We're often told about this stuff called fresh air on the outside of the building and how good it is to come on the inside. We've seen how unstable the air is outside, and a lot of times it's also fairly polluted as well. So there's a real debate about whether you actually want to let too much of that air in. All of our buildings are pretty leaky anyway, so there's quite a lot of ventilation going on, and that's not a problem. But by introducing that slightly scary looking red air on the outside into the building, what you will do is increase the instability in the building. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know. It's case by case, but it's very important that one recognizes it before you start ventilating or building in ventilation as part of your project, that you know what it's likely to do. Now, I will show you and talk about some good examples in a moment, but this is what goes wrong. Uncontrolled ventilation of, in this case, warm wet air comes into a cold spring building. You get condensation on your paintings, on your monuments, you get corrosion, you get all sorts of things going on. So simply introducing uncontrolled ventilation with the exterior can be very damaging. It can also be very useful. I can't think of many examples with ventilation in roofs where you overventilate. So that's a relatively safe space to do it. Underneath pews as well, where you're against moist earth, ventilation from the outside there can be extremely beneficial. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is a very powerful tool. It tends to, because it's free, because you're not paying for it, it tends to be poorly thought through. So just think through, if you are introducing different airflows into your building, how it will affect it. And there are all sorts of clever ventilation methodologies you can use as well. I mean, this is a classic one. We tend to refer to it as borrowed air. So if you have a damp crypt and you have a nice big church on top, which is in good condition, why worry about doing air conditioning in the crypt below if you can just exchange the air, if you can just mix the good air with the air downstairs and actually produce a, effectively, it's simply a matter of producing air conditioning, which is already occurring through natural means in the upper part of the church. So there are lots of ways that you can manipulate air exchange, but it's a complicated thing to do and you need to think it through. Local heating, local heat loss. There's all sorts of views on church furnishings. But basically the question is, if you want to insulate yourself from the cold floor and the cold bench, you can do it through furnishings. It is appropriate in some spaces, it's not in others, but recognize it as a tool which is useful to use. And yet again, the point about dressing, depending on the church. If you are in one of those churches that is going to be used a few times a year and not in the winter, dressing appropriately is not an unreasonable thing to ask, and even to let people know about. People are so unused to some of these buildings now that people don't dress appropriately and then feel uncomfortable, and that dilutes the experience of being in some of these rather wonderful buildings. With heating and projects involving changing warming, I tend to think of rather than heating. Planning is all, as I've said before, and I think it's extremely useful to use. We tend to refer to it as the 4 Ws. Who are you heating? What sort of people are you? Children running around or people sitting, listening to a concert? What are they doing? Where in the church? Some of our churches are tiny, some are enormous. You don't need to heat throughout. And when? How long are these activities taking place? What time of the day are they going to be taking place? It's very useful to map this out, and also even with a plan to sort of mark out your zones and then say, right, these are our heating patterns. This is something you can give to a heating engineer to say, this is what we're trying to do. And they'll probably say, well, we can't really separate it out this much, but we can separate out that section and this section. So planning this through with a drawing, with a list of activities, puts you in a much stronger position. We'll look a little bit more in the final bit about heating, just because it is something that comes up again and again. We've discussed the issue with convection and warm air, yet more examples of air heating up church vaults. If you can picture what your heating does and where the heat goes, you are in a much stronger position to actually design it well. Convective heating, as I said before, you have this a question of buoyancy, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you will all, I'm sure, be familiar with pew heaters like this. If you're generating your convective warmed air in the right location, then it can do the job of rolling over people and keeping them warm before it disperses. If you have it like that, and the people are down at the bottom, it doesn't do any good at all. So convective heating is not necessarily a problem, but it's just how it's set up and how you've understood it to be used. Radiant heating, on the other hand, poor old radiant heating's got a very bad rap over the years because it used to be those horrible red radiators on the walls which toasted your head and gave you sort of asymmetric warming, which is very uncomfortable. But of course, there are many types of radiant heating. Underfloor heating is one that we're now all becoming very familiar with. Pew panels, wall panels are so much more efficient than they used to be. So the options of, rather than heating the air, heating the local space are much more it's much more efficient than was previously the case. Again, it comes down to that coloured plan of saying, well, what am I going to be doing? Because if I'm going to be using the whole space 7 days a week, maybe you do want to fill it full of warm air, and maybe that's an acceptable use of energy. If you are going to use it very periodically, maybe you just want to localize your heat into a few pews. Maybe you only have 20 people who come, or a dozen, and they only use those pews. That's where you want to use your very small financial budget and your carbon footprint efficiently. Underfloor heating, as we are referring, actually, just see, you can see in that top right one, which is King's College Chapel, how underfloor heating works and brings the heat, which is relatively low temperature, very close to people. Underfloor heating is intrusive. It is complicated to do, and it doesn't work in all churches. And I'm aware of the time now, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. But there are porous systems which allow water to evaporate through the floor, and there are non-porous systems, the Jupiter one on the left-hand side and the Glypore and Limecrete on the right-hand side. One of the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues with underfloor heating is its impact on archaeology. You've got to dig down to put it there. In some cases, you have got the archaeology has already been disturbed in the 19th century. It's very easy to make your 500 mil hole. In some cases, it's not. One of the impacts of underfloor heating, which tends to cause problems, is how it affects the hydrology, the water in the ground. Because in a lot of churches, the whole floor is porous and the walls are porous as well. So when all of that water, which is in the soil under the church, evaporates out, the load is spread across the floor, the walls, all over the place. If you put something which seals the floor in, all of the water is driven towards the edge, and then through capillary rise rises up your walls and evaporates there and causes damage on the most sensitive bit. It might be carved masonry, you might be lucky, it might just be plaster, but it's often lovely masonry or monuments or all these other things. So by putting in underfloor heating and not thinking it through and how water is driven up the walls, you can cause immense damage. That's why there are discussions about the different types of underfloor heating that you can successfully and safely put in, and we can discuss that in the Q&A afterwards if you like. It's a big intervention. It is a tremendously big intervention, but of course, if it works and if it's an appropriate building, it then frees you up to do all sorts of things in that open space. Another problem which constantly comes up with heating, new and old, is location of emitters. If you're not using underfloor heating, you need to put emitters somewhere, you need to put heaters somewhere. It's very difficult to find safe places to put them in churches. I mean, here's a late 19th century example, definitely not a safe place to put. You can see exactly what's happened with accelerated evaporation on the column, driving water up and evaporating out and causing salt damage. A rather more recent example of a wonderful screen in a church, and you can see the effect of the heater immediately behind the screen. Really rather terrifying. And this is the sort of thing that happens as a result. Timber continues to flex and remains supple and responsive to moisture variations throughout its history. I've worked on timber which is thousands of years old and it still works. Paints become much more brittle over time as they chemically change, and if you combine brittle paints with responsive timber, you end up with this sort of failure. So that's really just to say, again, think through the unintended consequences of where you're generating heat rather than concentrating on the fact that on the other side of the screen, the people in the pews were going to get very nice and cozy and warm. So some key points. We're using buildings in ways that they haven't been used before. We are demanding an awful lot more of them, and therefore we need to think through very carefully what our changes are likely to do, both in terms of the positive side for us, but especially in terms of the negative side for the buildings. The thing about planning, I cannot overemphasize. The best possible projects that I work on are the ones where people have spent the most time arguing about it all, first of all defining their aims and then how they're going to get there before it really starts to kick off and shape up into a project. The worst ones are when there is a vague aspiration for a multifunctional space, which has never really been defined and which has never really been thoroughly discussed by the PCC or whatever the client group is. Get the right independent advice. There's a lot of poor advice out here. There's a lot of advice which is linked to sales and supply out there. It is difficult, but the CBC are very good at advising you how to find that information, the DAC often also. But try and get good independent advice early on rather than going to the heating supplier and say, how do we do something? Building conservation and maintenance. I know this is something that anyone who looks after a church will roll their eyes at. It is so difficult to achieve, but the maintenance side is as important as the capital works on the building. And without it, that investment will fail. And then unfortunately, everything else down the line will just work worse. If you're looking at heat and warmth, address heat loss before you address heat input. You don't need to pour in lots and lots of heat if in fact you're keeping most of it in there. And a lot of the times when people say they need buildings which have more capacity for heating, you look at the building and find actually they're losing a lot of what they've got already. If you're going down the heating process, look at the 4 W's, the what, when, where, who question to actually define exactly what you're trying to do, because it will help your heating designer. Can you afford to keep on running these things? Again, I see some very clever systems put in, and look at the finances going forward on these and think this will not be sustainable in 10 years' time because the income isn't there, both for running a system and maintaining it. And lastly, plan for unintended consequences. See if you can break it. Go through your plan. What will happen here? Can I make this actually go wrong? And that way you will recognize the things that will go wrong and you can design around them. Most of them can be recognized. It's very, very unusual to come up with a new problem. But it's very usual for people to ignore known problems because they're so focused on delivering the positive, the happy side of the project. So those are the key points. Some resources you will find much that Catherine and others have been working on the Church Care website. You probably know all these links already. And more general building environment, the book we wrote with Historic England in the Practical Building Conservation series, the Historic England Building Performance Guidance, which should be out. It's actually come out of the website rather than PDF in spring. And an older version of that, which is knocking around on the internet now, guidance for the HLF, which tackles a lot of these sorts of issues in development projects. Good, I think that's probably all we've got time for, before hopefully some questions. Catherine.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Tobit. You really do know a lot about a lot of projects, don't you? Could you stop sharing your screen so that they can see us both? No, we do indeed have, I have to say first, the emphasis on maintenance, I can't agree with enough. Just the importance of the basics is so important. It's so difficult, isn't it? But it's so important. So the top question at the moment, oh, this has come up several times. It's such a difficult question. Ventilation for conservation best practice, reconciling that with ventilation advice for COVID at this current period that we're in now. Any wisdom on that?
Yes. It's difficult. I mean, the two things are directly in conflict. I think the good thing one can say is that when we're talking about deterioration, in most cases, it's over a very long period of time. So the fact that we are breaking the rules now for a couple of years, it's not ideal, but it is only for a short period of time. I mean, like a lot of conservation advice, I know some conservation advisors are very strict about these things. And you must use it like this, you must use it like that. I think I'm a little more relaxed about breaking the rules if you know what they are. The danger is that people then move into a sort of a system where, oh, well, it's heating more than ventilation, actually. We will do things in a way which suits us, but isn't terribly good for the building, constantly. Doesn't matter if you break the rules a little bit, but don't keep on doing it. And so with the COVID thing, obviously there are priorities. And at the moment, the environmental health one is the priority. So with few exceptions, if you are in a church which is stuffed with, I don't know, 17th century poplar panel paintings, probably don't use it and work around it. But if you're in your average church, the risk is low in the short term.
Good. Question about ceiling fans. What about a fan in the roof to drive the heat down to the pews? Now, my understanding is that those really aren't advised, that they're not generally seen as working. Is that right? Am I up to date?
I think you are. I mean, it's slightly missing the point. If you are going to go to the difficulty of putting heat into churches, put it in the right place. Ceiling fans, they will make things more turbulent, but they won't make the air less buoyant. So hot air will still want to go up, and you end up in all sorts of complications. I've not seen really good evidence that they are the way forward. They might be a short-term patch, but they're a big intervention, and also they're not pretty. So I wouldn't go down that route in 90% of cases.
Lovely. The next question is about, you said this might come up in the Q&A at the end, was about the difference between porous and non-porous underfloor heating systems. When do you want one or the other? I think that's the sense of the question.
So most of our churches are sitting in moist earth of one sort or another. So most of them allow this evaporation through. If you stop that, as I say, you drive it onto the walls. So ideally, if you're using underfloor heating, no, not ideally, essentially, you need to have a porous system. Even the Glypor and the Limecrete system changes the hydrology, the moisture dynamics in the floor. So you wouldn't want to run it right up to the edges, because even that is going to cause other problems. Plus you're heating the walls, which are evaporating. So you need a decent boundary. It is debatable how big the boundary, and it's rather dependent on case by case. The other system, the Jupiter type systems, there are more porous versions of that, but basically they're putting in a synthetic, thin, very efficient insulation layer. Now, if you've already got a 19th century cement floor, which is pretty much non-porous anyway, there is much more of an argument for being allowed to use a non-porous heating system on top of it. Again, it's entirely case by case, but that tends to be the difference. The successful ones tend to be on buildings which already have a non-porous base, and you're just putting stuff on top of it. That's a complete summary and sketch, and it won't fit for half the cases, but does that give you a rough idea of where we're going?
Well, how are we doing? We're 1 minute to 5 with one question and one comment left. If you have a summer-only church, how do you measure what heat you need to preserve fabric in winter? And I think that points to a wider question, doesn't it, about when we need to heat the fabric and when actually we can just leave the fabric well alone.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's not entirely straightforward. In those sorts of circumstances, the use of heat is really to control the moisture rather than because we want heat. Most of our building materials aren't particularly sensitive to heat. They're sensitive to humidity and relative humidity. So the question would be, how do you manage that space to avoid condensation is one of the biggest risks. And particularly when you go from the sort of the closed winter to the open spring summer, which is when the condensation risk is at its highest, because nice warm wet air outside, chilled closed building. So you would have to look at that again case by case, but what you're looking at is controlling humidity and condensation rather than controlling temperature, although it's temperature you're using as your tool, because that's the one thing you've got. Oh, actually, no, Catherine, the same with ventilation as well. You could just fling open your windows and you get exactly what we saw in that slide. Or you could use it much more carefully, and you could control your ventilation, only open it in at particular times of day or particular weather. And I've seen that done, I have to say not in this country, but I've seen it done in some particularly cold country very, very well indeed. And that just takes time, not cost.
Very good. Now, I'm conscious there's a couple of things there left, but it is 5 o'clock. I have a hard cut off today. I've got exciting evening plans. Thank you so much, Tobit. It's so clear whenever I speak to you, just the depth and the breadth of your knowledge is very impressive. Thank you so much. As I said at the beginning, we are running this session again in 3 weeks' time. So if you found it useful and you think you've got colleagues who would, please let them know that it is coming. After today, it won't be tomorrow because I've got the day off, but beginning of next week, I'll send round the slides if you can let me have the latest version, Tobit, and the links from the chat, and a link to our feedback form. Thank you all for coming along today, and I do hope you found it useful.
And Catherine, I would say if people do want to follow up specific points, because I know it's been erased through, by all means, email me. I'm very happy to respond if I can.
Brilliant. That's very kind. Thanks and goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.